Now, the last thing that we discussed, which is here on page Mem, was the Rambam's objection to the BaHaG, to the Baal Halachos, as to why he was willing to include mitzvos like Hanukkah and Megillah and Hallel and Mea Brachos B'chol Yom, but he refused to include the mitzvah of Eruv and the mitzvah of Netilas Yadayim. Those two mitzvahs were omitted from the counting of the Taryag, even by the BaHaG, and the Rambam claims that the BaHaG is not being consistent, because if he admits into the membership club of Taryag mitzvahs, even mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, like Chanukah and Purim and Hallel, then why doesn't he accept Eruv Tchumen, or for that matter, Netilas Yadayim, as mitzvahs in Taryag? So the Ramban offers two different approaches to defend the BaHaG against the Rambam's onslaught. The first approach of the Ramban is that the BaHaG will not count what we call a siyag, when the Rabbanon, by virtue of the authority vested in them to set up a harchaka, a siyag, a fence around the Torah, which is derived from the Pasuk Asu Mishmeres L'Mishmarti, then it's not a mitzvah unto itself, but rather it's a protection and an extension of whatever mitzvah it is. So, for example, the Torah tells us not to carry on Shabbos, and there are many different shvusim, which are siyagim and gzeros, which are Rabbanan institute to keep a person far away from violating hotzah. Or, for example, in the case of truma, the Torah says that you cannot be matame and contaminate the truma. That's a doraisa. And the Rabbanan said, wash your hands, which might have contracted tumah, in order to guarantee that you would not come to pick up truma in your hands. Those do not deserve to be counted in the Taryag, even according to the BaHaG, who's willing to include the Rabbanans, because we've already counted the mitzvah of truma and its shmiras hatara. We've already counted the mitzvah of Shabbos and the various prohibitions of Shabbos. So just because the Rabbanan are extending it and setting up a siyag to keep you far away from non-fulfillment of the Torah, that doesn't mean it should deserve a separate category. But in the cases of Chanukah and Megillah, or Mea Brachos B'chol Yom, or Hallel, there the Rabbanan are creating a brand new mitzvah. It's not a subcategory, a protection, or an extension of a pre-existing mitzvah. That was the first approach of the Ramban to defend the BaHaG. The second approach, which we're about to finish up, we didn't finish it up last week, is that the Ramban is bothered, as the Rambam was, by the bracha. We make a bracha on setting up an Eruv. Asher Kidshorim Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu al Mitzvahs Eruv. Or in the case of Netilas Yadayim, we make a bracha on Netilas Yadayim. So that would seem to indicate that the Rabbanan are creating a brand new mitzvah. Even though, again, as we said earlier in the first approach of the Ramban, both Eruvin and Netilas Yadayim are meant to protect you from violating the Torah law, but nevertheless, the fact that we make a bracha on it, the Gemara goes as far as to say, what do you mean, Asher Kidshonim Mitzvosav V'Tzivanu, Heichan Tzivanu? And the Gemara answers, Lo Sasur, which means that the Rabbanan are vested with the authority to mandate and commission various prohibitions and mitzvos and so forth, and on that we make a bracha. So just like we make a bracha on Ner Chanukah, and we make a bracha on Mikra Megillah, and we make a bracha on Hallel, And all these in the language of Asher Kitshon Mitzvosa, we make a bracha on Eruvin and on Netilas Yadayim, Asher Kitshon Mitzvosa V'tzivonim. So at this point, the Ramban feels compelled to offer a second alternative defense for the BaHaG as to why he omits Eruvin and Netilas Yadayim. And the Ramban says the following. There's something called a mitzvah b'chiyuv. And we'll explain. And in contrast, so we'll see the difference between the two. There's a mitzvah which is called shevi al taseh. So what's a mitzvah b'chiyuv? A mitzvah b'chiyuv means akum v'aseh. You are commanded to do something actively. Then there's something called shevi al taseh, where the Torah is saying abstain from a certain action. In the first case, the compliance requires an action, right? It's active. In the second category, we're talking about something that requires inaction, the absence of action, which is called shevi al taseh in the terminology of the Ramban. And the Ramban points out that although setting up a tchum, meaning an eruv, or washing your hands, intuitively, what we call a knee-jerk response, if I were to ask you, is that a kuvaseh, an action, or is it a non-action? What would be our response? It's an action, am I right? You have to wash your hands. You have to take Muslim Shtei Sudos and place it, 2,000 amo out of the boundary of the city. Says Ramban, no. It's not what you call a kuvaseh or a mitzvah b'chiyuv. And why not? Says the Ramban, because you're not obligated. A mitzvah b'chiyuv, by definition, in the essential definition, requires an obligation. Nowhere does the Torah obligate me to wash my hands. What does that mean? Says the Ramban very dramatically, you could have one person who eats 10 meals a day, so he washes his hands 10 times for Netilas Yadayim. And you could have another person who ate 1 meal a day, or 0 meals a day, and he didn't have Netilas Yadayim more than once, or 0, and they're both the same. We wouldn't say that one has a greater mitzvah than the other, because there is no mitzvah of Netilas Yadayim. The Torah is just saying that if you want to eat, you need a matir. You have to do something in order to remove an isur. That's really shevi al taseh. That's like non-activity. You want to go outside into your chotzer and carry something, you need an eruv. You want to go outside the bounds of the city, the boundaries of the city, 2,000 am and more, you need an eruv. But who says you need an eruv? Meaning, are you required to do an eruv? A mitzvah has to have a requirement. It's not just the avoidance of an isur by instituting an action which is a matir. And the Ramban's beautiful example is from shechita. We make a bracha on shechita, and the Gemara says it explicitly in Psachim Daf Zayin and Beis, and yet we don't count shechita amongst the Taryag mitzvos. Why not? And the answer is because shechita is not a positive command. Shechita is only to avoid the violation of a losaseh. The Torah says that you're not allowed to eat nevela. How do you avoid eating nevela? By doing shechita. Shechita is a matir. It removes the isur nevela. Also, by the way, on the side, it removes an isur of Erev and Achai. But be that as it may, that in the Ramban's conceptual structure is basically a lav. It's a lav haba mechal essay. But there's no real essay. There's no positive command. So therefore, and this is where we stopped, we got up to last week, we now on page mem on the left column, 6 lines up from the bottom, Vehech yakpid al bal halachos. How could the Rambam express his disappointment, if you will, with the Baal Halachos, sheyimna mitzvah kazumi divrei sofrim, that the BaHaG will count, let's say, Chanukah and Purim and so forth, even though they're D'Rabbanan. V'eino moneh kayotze ba min Torah. He says that even if you had a mitzvah in a Torah that was similar to these mitzvahs of Erevin and Netilas Yadayim, we would not count it. And what's the paradigmic case? Shchita. Shchita is min Torah, and yet we don't count it in Tayyan. Ki ein etzel bal halachos ba b'minyan mitzvahs aseh, ela mitzvahs sheyesh shehen bekuv aseh. Shasiyasa mitzvah leinu. Mitzvah leinu means obligation. The Torah obligates us to do an action. Sometimes the Torah sets conditions. Like, for example, you have to put tzitzis on a beged if the beged has 4 knafos and you wear the beged. If you're not wearing a beged of 4 knafos, you're not chayiv in the mitzvah. But once you're wearing a beged of 4 knafos, then you have to put tzitzis on the beged. So that's called a mitzvah b'kuv aseh, shu mitzav aleim, asiyasa mitzvah aleinu. The asiyah is obligatory. When you have a mitzvah which is coming because you want to avoid a lav, avoid violating an isur, the ein b'shvisasa mitzvah b'siyasan, if the asiyah is not coming to fulfill a mitzvah, you see in Chanukah and Purim, reading the Megillah on Purim, you are doing an asiyah of a mitzvah. The Torah, through the Rabbanon, is obligating you to light Ner Chanukah and to read the Megillah on Purim and to recite Hallel and to recite 100 brachas a day. That will be counted in Taryah. Why? Because that's Bichlal Lo Sos. But in a case where the asiyah or the shvisa is only to avoid a lotas, but in and of itself, it's not an obligatory mitzvah. Like, for example, there's no mitzvah to set up an eruv, just stay home. There's no mitzvah to wash netilas yadayim, just don't eat bread. Is einon bos ba b'cheshbon. That will not be included in the cheshbon. Ella im nemru b'lav. Unless you want to count it as a lav. But again, as we said before, there's no counting of a lav here because we already counted the lav. We have the lav of Shabbos, we have the lav of Truma, of Shmiras HaTruma. Is therefore hulo mona shchita, and the precedent here is that the BaHaG will not count shchita. Because shchita is considered a shevi al taseh. What does that mean, a shevi al taseh? You can't be passive and have shchita, you need to actively shech the animal. But the purpose of shech the animal is just to avoid eating nevela, eating non-kosher meat that wasn't shechted properly. But there's no obligation of shechita per se. A person can live his whole life without picking up a chalif once in his life, and he's fine. Okay, so that was just to finish up the second argument of the Rambam against the Ramban. So against the BaHaG. Let's just go over it one more time. The first argument of the Rambam is, how can you count mitzvahs aseh when it wasn't given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai? The second argument is, if you're already counting mitzvahs aseh, even though they're D'Rabbanan, then why don't you count Erevin and Netilas Yadayim? And now we're up to page Mem Beis Vatshuva Shlishis, the third argument of the Rambam against the BaHaG.
Do we know what the BaHaG would say in return? How would he answer the Rambam? I mean,
That's what the Ramban is trying to do. The BaHaG was before the Rambam, so
right.
the BaHaG didn't have the slings and arrows of the Rambam, but the Ramban in the next generation goes back to the BaHaG and tries to defend the BaHaG.
I mean,
And so far, he's doing a good job
it's
until
not
he
as if
gets to
there's
the third argument to the Rambam. What?
I'm not sure if there's an agenda necessarily, but is the BaHaG trying to strengthen the Rabbanans so that they're not taken lightly or lighter
Well,
than derided? Some of the
I don't
some
I don't know how to answer your question, Bruce, because I'm not the BaHaG, but I definitely think that he accomplished that goal, whether consciously or deliberately or not consciously. Meaning, if you ask me what motivated the BaHaG, my approach would be the conceptual understanding of what Taryag Mitzvahs is all about.
so he has no introduction, or he doesn't have some writing somewhere on why
No,
he
he
does
just
what
gives
he
you the
does.
list, and the Rambam just attacks that list. How could you include Hanukkah and Megillah in that list, or Hallel? This is mitzvahs that came way, way later than Har Sinai. And the Gemara says Taryag mitzvahs never Moshe Rabbeinu Bar Sinai. Did Moshe Rabbeinu receive the mitzvah of Hanukkah before the battles against the Greeks? Did Moshe Rabbeinu receive the mitzvah of Purim before the defeat of Haman? How can you count that in Taryag?
I think sometimes when one overspeaks or oversells an item, it sometimes diminishes the product itself. And therefore, the Rambam's question on that is such an obvious question that everyone would ask, that the desire to oversell what's clearly given later by whatever logic one can apply, I wonder what effect that had on the population, who understands very clearly that post mitzvot given by rabbis are not given in the Torah, despite the logical permutations to try to prove something.
Right.
Because like today, we would say Yom Ha'atzmaut is in the Torah, and some would have a svara for it. Nobody would be very happy with that. Even though it might have some logical, you could say, wow, what a pill pull type of a rationale, but it wouldn't fly. And I wonder if there's similar here, just what the mood was in response to the BaHaG, other than the Ramban. There must have been many other writers contemporaneous with him who either supported him or didn't support him for whatever reason. I mean,
right. But the Ramban's goal is to try to defend the BaHaG against the Rambam. It's a very noble goal. By the way, the Ramban also wrote an entire work to defend the Rif against the slings and arrows of the Baal Hamor, which is called Milchemes Hashem, the battle for God. But in doing so, I think I would comment that the Ramban makes his own breakthroughs here. There are a lot of chidushim here. That's why I'm so excited about this limud. I wonder whether, your chevra may be less oriented and interested in reading a text of a Ramban. To me, from the base measures that I come from, the ability to try to plow through a Ramban is a tremendous tool and a tremendous challenge. And I'm not going to tell you that I understand every word of the Ramban. By far, I'm not going to boast about that, but I feel that the effort to understand the Ramban is just a glorious Talmud Torah effort. And it gives you tools that you can apply. And keep in mind, the Ramban had a tremendous impact on the history of the development of Torah, both in Hashkafa and in Halacha. The Ramban was a unique integration of so many different dimensions. On the one hand, he has a commentary on the Torah, an amazing commentary on the Torah. And I would say you could dedicate your entire life to trying to understand just the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. On the other hand, the Ramban has Chidushim on Shas, another lifelong endeavor. To boot, the Ramban is a python. He writes poetry, and we see it right here. The next line we're going to read is poetry. On top of that, the Ramban was a physician. To boot, he was a leader of Klal Yisrael. But I think in a certain sense, the most important element of the Ramban is that he's an amazing link to the tradition and the transmission of Torah. His primary student was the Rashba, and I can't begin to describe the significance of the Rashba. Today, for example, anyone who's studying for smicha, for the rabbinate, is going to spend endless amount of time and energy on the Rashba. And who was the Rashba? He was a Talmud of the Ramban. Who was the Talmud of the Rashba? Was the Ritva. And then we go down to the Ran and how it goes. It keeps going on and on. I would say that in what we call the Chachmei Sfarad, we have two major luminaries, the Rambam and the Ramban. And the way I was brought up, the Rambam is greater than the Ramban. But you know what? At this age of my life, I don't know anymore. I'm not sure anymore. I can tell you that in some sense, the Rambam was greater than the Ramban. But in another sense, the Ramban was much greater. So to plow through a Ramban, the Ramban was not wasting his time over here when he wrote pages and pages and pages to understand and defend the BaHaG. All right, so I got off a little on a tangent, but now we're up to Hatshuva Shlishis. This is the third attack of the Rambam against the BaHaG. And I think here's where we separate between the men and the boys, because the Ramban himself is not going to be satisfied with his attempt to defend the BaHaG. Libi Aleha Oshis. Again, poetry from Tanakh. I will focus my heart on trying to understand it. Vehine Ganvasa Ruach Kodim Charishis. I think he's already intimating perhaps that this is a tough one, a real tough nut to crack. Ganvasa, I think, means when something sneaks in from left field, so to speak, from out of the shadows. Ruach Kodim Charishis, a very powerful Ruach. Omar Rav Zatzal, he's now quoting the Rambam. Ha'pliya ha'gedola li'eze inyan manu mitzvah seishem d'Rabbanan. I don't get it, says the Rambam. If you, the BaHaG, are willing to count positive mitzvos d'Rabbanan as part of Taryag, Chanukah, Purim, Hallel, Mea Brachos, all these are mitzvahs aseh. We divide up the mitzvahs into two fundamental categories, mitzvahs aseh and mitzvahs lo saseh. Says the Rambam, Lo manu kmochem mitzvahs lo saseh she'im d'Rabbanan. There are many lo sasehs that are only d'Rabbanan. They're not in the Torah at all. And the BaHaG doesn't count any of them. Because the achas v'esrim lo saseh. There are 21 arayos, meaning sexually forbidden women, that are all d'Rabbanan. 21 of them. Can you imagine what that would do to the numbers of Taryag? But each and every one of them is a lo taseh. To the same extent the Torah says that you can't have a relationship with your sister, the Torah says you can't have a relationship. The Rabbanan said that you can't have a relationship with the sister of your chalutza. So what does that mean? That means that Ruvain married Rachel. Rachel has a sister named Leah. Ruvain dies childless. He has a brother named Shimon. And Shimon now has a mitzvah of Yibum to marry Rachel, the widow of his deceased brother who died without children. Okay, so that's an Isur I'm sorry, that's a mitzvah of Yibum between Ruvain, the late Ruvain's wife, Rachel, and Shimon, the surviving brother. Shimon decides, I'm out of here. I have no interest whatsoever in marrying Rachel. So he gives Rachel chalitza. And now the Rabbanan say that he's not allowed to marry Leah, the sister of Rachel. Leah is not his sister. Leah is the sister of his chalutza. That's called achos chalutzasa, a big sugya Masechta Yevamos. The entire sugya of the 21 categories of arayos is in Masechta Yevamos, Adaf Chaf Aleph. And the Gemara calls them gzeros. The Ramban is going to make a big deal about that. But the Rambam is saying, wait a minute, what are the categories of erva that are prohibited? Well, they fall into two categories. There's an erva d'oraisa and there's an erva d'Rabbanan. But the erva d'Rabbanan is no less of a d'Rabbanan than the mitzvah of Chanukah or Purim. So if you, BaHaG, are going to be consistent and you're going to count mitzvahs d'Rabbanan, why did you fall shy of counting los hases d'Rabbanan? There's an Iser erva d'Rabbanan. And that's called Shniyos L'Arayos. So the Torah says you can't marry your daughter, you can't marry your mother. That's an erva d'oraisa. The Rabbanan said you can't marry the mother of your mother, you can't marry the daughter of your daughter. That's already Shniyos L'Arayos. You have another category of an erva. You have an Iser Lav Midrabbanan. So a mitzvah's Aseh d'Rabbanan, you do count. But a mitzvah's Los Aseh d'Rabbanan, you don't count. Where's the consistency here?
And do we know why these midrabbanans were added?
In each case, the Gemara in Yevamos on Daf Chaf Aleph goes through each Shniyos L'Arayos and tells you why we're afraid that if we let you marry the mother of your mother, you might come to have a relationship with your mother, and so forth and so on. Each case comes under a zera, and the Gemara spells out each
the sister of the chalutza, which seems to have no connection.
Oh, achos chalutzoso?
Yes.
I'll give you a minute. I haven't learned Yevamos in a while. Just 1 second. Achos chalutzoso. Oh, achos chalutzoso was a gzera otu chalutzoso. The Torah prohibits marrying your chalutza. The same woman that the Torah obligates you to marry, the Torah prohibits you to marry if you gave a chalitza. That's a doraisa.
But then her sister.
And now we're afraid that if we allow you to marry her sister, you might marry her as well. That's what I remember from Yevamos. But in any event, the principle is the same, that every case of Shniyos L'Arayos is a gzera. The Gemara in Yevamos goes a step further. The Gemara wants to know, should we prohibit woman X because it might lead you to marry woman Y, and woman Y herself is a Shniyos L'Arayos. Do you follow? So the Gemara says, no, that far we're not going to go because we have a principle called Ein Gozrin Gzera L'Gzera. We don't make a Gezerah onto a Gzera, which in and of itself is only a Gzera. That's the general principle. Again, there may be exceptions to that rule, but in every exception, you'll have to answer why it's an exception.
And does a mamzer result from marrying a woman that's a Rabbanan?
Yeah, I think that's called a mamzer d'Rabbanan, which is in worse shape than a mamzer d'oraisa. Anyway. Says the Ramban, "V'das bal halachas gedolos bazel lo neflesi v'lo rechokehi." I think he's paraphrasing a pasuk in at the end of the Torah. What's the parsha called? the very short parsha has only 30 psukim. What's it called? Vayelech, right? So there the Torah goes to the mitzvah of tshuva, and it says, Lo neflesi v'lo rechoki. It's not far away from you. And the Ramban is paraphrasing those words, using them here to say that we can defend and understand where the BaHaG is coming from, and it's not far from us. Shekol gzeira shegosu chachom lasos yag leTorah delo liga b'isura doraisa eino ba b'cheshbon hazeh. Any time that the Rabbanon make a gzeira to prevent you from violating a Torah law, that doesn't get included in the Taryag. Ki inyan shach shishis b'chametz. What about chametz on Erev Pesach on the 14th of Nisan? The Torah prohibits you from chatzos hayom, the beginning of the 7th hour, or called the end of the 6th hour. And the Rabbanan said, no, we're not going to let you eat chametz from the beginning of the 5th hour. We're going to give you that 1 hour harchaka, because we're afraid if you eat chametz in the 5th hour, you'll come to eat chametz in the 6th hour, meaning at the end of the 6th hour, beginning of the 7th hour, which is a violation of a doraisa. So now, are we going to count in Taryag the Isur D'Rabbanan of chametz in the 5th hour? No. Aval geder lemitzvah shel Torah. It's only a protection from the mitzvah of the Torah, and the Torah enjoins you from eating chametz in the 6th hour. V'chelek mimena, and it's a part of that mitzvah, or in this case, lotas. Same thing in Shnias L'Arayos. Shnias L'Arayos Gzeira or to a certain erva, which is included in Taryag because it's Doraisa. But when the Rabbanan are making a Gzeira to prevent you from violating the Doraisa, that Gzeira is included in the mitzvah Doraisa. It's just encompassed within it. It's a subcategory, if you will. So, for example, we're not going to count 39 malachos on Shabbos as 39 separate lavim in Taryag. It's only one. There are 39 different ways and methods of violating that one single Isur. The same thing in Gzeros. Gzera means the Rabbanan is saying that you're basically violating the original Isur Doraisa if you violate this, because X will lead to Y. But it's not a separate mitzvah independent of itself. Vashnios kulon, and every one of the 21 shnios, kula mishum srachen, they're all instituted by the Rabbanan because they're afraid that you might come to violate an Erev Doraisa mitam gzera asrosan. And I'll prove it to you. The Gemara says in Masechet Yevamos Chaf Aleph, Hacha ilav shnios kopaga b'erva. If not for the Rabbanan instituting an Isur shnios, a person would violate an erva. Paga means touch, literally, but it means to come in contact with an erva and violate a rayos. V'sham amru. Now he turns to Yevamos Amid Beis. Od. He gufa gzera vanan nekum v'nigzar gzera l'gzera. Let's see if I can find this. Yeah, this is a statement of Rav Safra. The Gemara has a suffix called Eshes Achi Ha'em. So you have a half uncle who shares the same mother as your mother, right? So your grandmother is the mother of your uncle and your mother. And this uncle, who's called Eshes Achi Imo Me Imo, marries a woman. And then he divorces her or he dies, whatever it is. Are you allowed to marry her? She's what we call in our parlance an aunt, or I guess if you're talking British, an aunt, or I think the Australians called it an auntie, whatever word you use. So the Gemara has a suffix whether or not she's included under shnios. That's your half uncle, if you follow what I mean. In other words, your uncle that shares a parent, in this case, a mother, maternal uncle with your mom, and that's his wife. All right, so this is a whole sugya. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Omar of Safra, he gufa gzera, vanan nekum v'nigzar gzera l'gzera. Oh, so you can have an uncle, what we call a paternal uncle, who shares the same father as your mother. And his wife is Shnios Larayos. Do you have it? So this is the wife of your uncle who shares, he's your uncle because he shares the same father as your mother. You know, so your grandfather is the father of both this fellow and your mother, and he has a wife. So the Gemara wants to know, should we institute an Iser called Shnias Larayos for the wife of your uncle who shares the same mother as your mother? So he's your maternal uncle. And the Gemara says that that's Gzera L'Gzera, because the Iser, you're afraid that if you allow in that case, you might come to that case, but the original case itself is only the Rabbanon. So therefore, Rav Safra says, I don't even understand your question. Why are you vacillating back and forth about the issue of the wife of your maternal uncle? That's a Gzera L'Gzera. We never make a Gzera L'Gzera. Omar Rava says, Atu kulu lav Gzera L'Gzera nin. He says that all Shnias Larayos are Gzera L'Gzera. What does that mean? Imo, Erva, right? The Torah prohibits a man from having a relationship with his mother. Imo, his grandmother, is a Shnia. Meaning that if you'll have a relationship with your grandmother, you might have a relationship with your mother. The Gazru, the Chacham said, Al Aim Aviv, Mishum Aim Imo. So you can have a grandmother through your mother, right? That's your maternal grandmother. You could have a grandmother through your father. That's a paternal grandmother. And both grandmothers are included on the Shnios Larayos. Yeah, the whole thing is so shocking to me. When you think about it, a man has a relationship with his grandmother. I mean, come on, that's got to be an Isa Doraisa, but it's not. It's only a Shnias Larayos. The Torah never prohibited having a relationship with one's grandmother. Could you imagine that? I mean, that's a little shocking. At least to me, it's shocking. I don't know. Anyway, so the Rabbanan were afraid of Aim Aviv, right, his father's mother, because of his mother's mother. So that's called Gzera L'Gzera. V'taimamai. So Rava says, why did the Rabbanan prohibit the paternal grandmother on the Shnios? It's Gzera L'Gzera to the maternal grandmother, which itself is Gzera, is Shnios. And he answers, Kulo debei ime rabase karole. It's like one Gzera on a grandmother. That includes both a maternal grandmother and a father grandmother. It wasn't that there were two stages. At stage one, they prohibited this grandmother. And at stage two, they were worried that if we allow that grandmother, you might have a relation with that grandmother. No. They prohibited from the get-go one grandmother, one category of a grandmother, whether it's your maternal grandmother or your paternal grandmother. That's called Kula Chad Gzera. But in any event, you see, says Ramban, that the entire entity of Shnios is all Gzera. Omar Rava atu kulu lav Gzera L'Gzera ninu. Aresha kulam Gzera. So we're not talking about counting a Gzera in Taryag. I mean, I would add a footnote here. If you want to count Gzeras in Taryag, there's no end. But rather, each Gzera is subsumed under a certain one of the Taryag, which is the Oraisa. So you have Aim, and now you have all these Surim of Shnios Atu Aim, because he might come to have a relationship with his mother. So that's his grandmother on this side, grandmother on that side. but it's nothing more than an extension of the Isur Torah of aim. It doesn't deserve to be counted as a separate mitzvah. Not because it's Rabbanon. That doesn't bother the BaHaG. The BaHaG would count it as a mitzvah in Taryag, even though it's the Rabbanon. But not when it's subsumed under another Isur, which is biblical, which is the Torah. Aval Mikra Megillah v'Nerchanik v'Halu Me'er Brachas v'Kol Shemona Ba'alachas Kedos Mitzvahs B'Fnei Atzmonein. Where are you going to classify Hanukkah? Where are you going to classify Mikra Megillah? Are they subsets of some mitzvah d'oraisa? Kol Shemona Baal halachos mitzvahs b'fnei atzmonein. Each one that the BaHaG includes on the Taryag is a mitzvah unto itself. It's not a subcategory. It's not a siag or a gzeira. Shenitztavenu b'hemi bezna gadol. Right? That's what we said. Lo sasu mikol shayirucha. We don't deviate and violate the authority and the obligations of bezna gadol. Ve'ein b'hem mishum harchaka gzeira v'harchaka b'yisuri Torah. Ve'elu hashnios gam kein lo nismechu le'lav de lo tosu. Right, lo tosu means that the Rabbanan are authorized to create a brand new entity like Ner Chanukah. But lo tosu has nothing to do with gzeros. Gzeros are the authority of the Rabbanan, and even more than that, the responsibility of the Rabbanan to institute gzeros that comes under mishmeres, not under lo tosu. Elem inyan b'mashmos haTorah. V'ein chachamim yecholim lichol osam b'isur Torah. Right? There would never be a possibility of like upgrading a gzera to an isur Torah. Elahein v'kayotze b'hen nismechu. They come under the mitzvah saseh u'shmartem es mishmarti. Now, this is interesting, by the way. When we talk about the authority of the rabbis, we should split into two categories, says the Ramban. There's one authority that's granted to the rabbis, vested in the rabbis by virtue of lo tasur, and there's another category, which is a separate category of authority vested in the Rabbanan under u'shmartem es mishmarti. I forget which parsha that's in, somewhere in Vayikra. I think maybe we read it last Shabbos. Yeah, I think we read it last Shabbos. Ushmartem es mishmarti. What is ushmartem es mishmarti? Right, the Torah itself is divided up into essays and los essays. The los essays are called mishmarti. Right, whenever the Torah uses the word shamar, that's a lo taseh. And the Torah wants to be careful to avoid X, Y, and Z, and that's called a lo taseh. And then the Torah says, ushmartem es mishmarti. So what does that mean? Mishmarti is a lo taseh. What's ushmartem es mishmarti? And Chazal understood that gives the Chachamim both a license and a response and an obligation to create a mishmeres to a mishmeres, meaning a mishmeres that'll protect us from violating a lo taseh. V'dor shisham v'seches yivamis asu mishmeres l'mishmarti. V'hikshu hado raisahi do raisahi u'pirshua rabbana. So the Gemara says that the Rabbana were interpreting a doraisa. So the Gemara says, Kol Torah nami Rabbanan Pershua. How can you tell me that this is an interpretation of the Torah? I mean, the Rabbanan are always interpreting the Torah. No. He's saying that Mirabana, the Rabbanan are giving a new entity, Mirabana, Kra Asmach to B'Alma. And the Pasuk is only an Asmach. So just to summarize, the third argument and objection of the Rambam against the BaHaG is why not count all the D'Rabbanans of lo taseh? And the Ramban's answer to defend the BaHaG is that those prohibitions come under the lo taseh. There's no need or justification to separate them and have them set up an independent mitzvah in Taryag. And in fact, the authority of the Rabbanan to create these gzeros that protect us from the Doraisa, from violating the Isur Lav Doraisa, that comes not under Lo Tasur, but under Ushmartem Es Mishmart. Vatshuva Ravius, and the fourth argument of the Rambam against the BaHaG, Shemana Baal Halachas Nichum Avelim. I jumped the gun before. I said that the Ramban himself sort of threw in the towel at one point, and he couldn't find a defense for the BaHaG, and I thought it was the Tshuva Shlishis. I made a mistake. The Tshuva Revius. Shemana BaHaG. Listen to the five additional a group of five additional mitzvahs that make up Taryag according to BaHaG. Number one, Nicham Avelim. Number two, Bikur Cholim. Number three, Kfuras Hames. Oh, I said four. And number four, Halbasha Sarum. Now, Rabbosai, even before we read the text, tell me intuitively why this is problematic. Anybody? I'm trying to get to know the names here. There's Harvey and there's Irving. I don't know if Irving is there or he's not there. I see Harvey. Hi, Harvey. Can you wave to me if you hear me? Oh, very good. I got a wave. Okay. So what would be your response to the BaHaG? If the BaHaG was saying a shir here, and you heard him say, well, let's count Nicham Avelim, Malbish Harumim, Hachnasas, Bikur Cholim, and Kfuras Hames, let's count that each one of them as a separate mitzvah in Taryag. Would you just sit there like a lemachol and accept him? Yeah, you're right.
I would have liked to have seen the rationale like the Rambam has a whole list, I think 14 rules for how he counts mitzvot.
Well, we're only up to the first rule.
Well, I'd like to see from the BaHaG, how does he come to the decision to make a list?
Again, we're trying to create the rules of the BaHaG. The BaHaG didn't write the rules. So Rambam wrote the rules.
No, you're saying, what would I ask the BaHaG? That's what I asked the BaHaG. Where is your list of rules? You must have had some in mind. Why didn't you write them down? Maybe he did. Maybe we just don't have them anymore.
Right. It's possible we don't have them. I can't answer that question. How many rules does the Rambam have? You said it was what?
I think 14.
14. Let me just double check that. I think you're right, but I'm not sure.
And I know that they all feel constrained about the number 613.
Yeah, 14. You're right.
They have to have that, number, which means that I'm curious from the BaHaG's perspective, is he aware that this is some type of a machloket? That if you have things on this, others don't, it means that other people things off.
The BaHaG was the revolutionary who took it upon himself first in the history to write to compile the 613. Unfortunately, he didn't give us the kaveh manche. He didn't give us the rules and the principles, and that's what the Ramban is trying to fill that in for us.
What year is that?
But I was asking a different question. I was hoping to evoke a response. What would you react to the BaHaG after he's telling you that he's adding 4 mitzvos to the counting of Taryag, including Nicham Avelim, Kfuras Hames, Levayas Bikur Cholim, right? Again, let's go over it. Nicham Avelim, Bikur Cholim, Kfuras Hames, and Albasha Sarumim. What would be your response? I mean, would you just sit there and shake your head?
It could be that those 4 fall into one umbrella category.
And what is that category?
Love fellow as yourself, or
exactly.
Yes.
And how do you love your fellow Jew? These are 4 categories. Now, it's true that the Rambam is going to object because they're all rabbinic in nature, and it was the rabbis who established these 4 categories, but the rabbis are only telling us how to fulfill and when to fulfill the mitzvah v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Like I always give the example, maybe if you were Shlomo Kalbach, Maybe it means you meet a person on the street, you hug him and you dance with him and you sing with him. Fine. Is that what the Torah obligates me? Is that I got to tap every Jew on the back and dance with him and hug him? And maybe yes, I don't know. But what I do know is that there's 4 categories of mitzvahs that all come under what we call chesed and avas Yisrael, but they're all different nuances and subcategories of the general rubric of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I wouldn't count them as separate mitzvahs.
I also might have thought that idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, it's a hashkafic idea. I'm not sure that one puts it into concrete examples, and maybe that's what the BaHaG is doing. It's too general. It must be concretized in some way.
Right.
It could be.
But then, again, would you expect the BaHaG to count Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv as 3 separate mitzvahs in Taryag?
No.
Now, the Torah commands me to pray, right? To l'spalel. But you need to tell me what that means. And the Rabbanan are going to flesh it out. But that doesn't mean that we're going to multiply mitzvahs in Taryag just because the Rabbanan are telling you, under what circumstances and how you to fulfill the mitzvah. Like, for example, Simchas Yom Tov. Okay, the Rabbanan are going to tell you that you do this, you do that, you do that. There are many different ways. Or the Torah says, Zachar Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. And the Rabbanan are going to go into many, many different questions about how you fulfill that mitzvah. And we go on and on and on. Like Chol HaMoed, for example, right? The Torah doesn't tell you how to fulfill Chol HaMoed. The Rabbanan are going to do that. So every single aspect of is going to be counted as a separate mitzvah. So the Torah gave me a general mitzvah v'ahavta. And the BaHaG understands that the Rabbanan have to step up to the plate and give me a grasp of the specifics and the nuances. How do I fulfill that mitzvah v'ahavta? But that doesn't justify the BaHaG's conclusion that every one of these categories should be counted as a separate mitzvah. There's no separate mitzvah of habashas harumim, to clothe the naked. There's no special mitzvah of comforting the bereaved. These are all different subcategories or dimensions or aspects of the mitzvah of Avas Yisrael. The Torah commands of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. That will be a mitzvah. And we've seen this in the Ramban over and over again. Like, for example, in the Tshuva Shlishis. So the Rambam says, well, why don't you count each one of the Shniyas Larayas and add another 21 mitzvahs? But and again, the Ramban says that they're only Xeros. They come under pre-existing categories. The Rambam objects to the BaHaG. Why doesn't he count Erev Tchumen? Why doesn't he count the Tilas Yadayim? And the Ramban says because those are just simply subcategories to prevent Truma from becoming contaminated or to prevent you from violating the Shabbos through Hotzah. They don't deserve to be counted as separate. Chanukah is a separate mitzvah. Megillah is a separate independent mitzvah, and Hallel is an independent mitzvah. But Nichum Avelim, Kvuras Mesim, these are just aspects, dimensions of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The Rabbanan are not trying to break new ground with new mitzvahs, and therefore we should expand the number. And look, just if I can just fit in one more line here, V'divrei Harav, the words of the Rambam, B'tshuva Zos, in this argument, Tmimim. Tmimim means they're perfect. Mipnei shedivrei bal halachas halumim. Because in this context, the words of the BaHaG are concealed, meaning we have no access to them. We really don't understand what the BaHaG did over here in counting 4 additional mitzvahs in Taryag. This is the first time. How many pages and pages have we learned in the Ramban? 20, 30, 40, I don't know how many pages. First time that we have what's called Odas Bal Din, and the Ramban says that the Rambam seems to be absolutely convincing, absolutely correct.
Well, that's why I asked earlier this is like a lifetime research project, a giant PhD coming up with the list. Right. And the fact that there's no rationale behind it, it's unfortunate for us today. But I wonder how constrained people feel with this number 613. So after making his list, he has 609. He said, what am I going to do? I have 609. I need 613.
I need another 4. I'm sure it's 4.
I'm short 4. I'm short
So
4.
plug these
Let me
in.
look over everything through the whole Torah, and I'm gonna come up with 4, because I need 4 more. And I
But
wonder if
the
that,
only problem is, okay, I understand you need 4 more, and you came up with these 4, but be consistent. Because if you're going to count these 4, I'm going to give you another couple of hundred that you should count.
well, that's
That's
what
what we're trying to do here. You understand? It's a very exciting puzzle over here. It's
well, you're presuming that everyone is always consistent, you know, perfect in their analysis. It may not be true.
okay, but we're going to make an
Not
attempt.
everybody does
We're
that.
not talking. Listen, Bruce, if you wrote a treatise, no offense, don't take me personally on this, but if you published a treatise, I don't know if Chachmei Yisrael over the course of the next 50 generations are going to break their head and try to figure out what Bruce had in mind.
Well, that's why there's footnotes,
But
and
we're
that's why
talking about the
with the
Baal
prophet.
Halachas Gedolos. Again, we should have had a couple of lectures here on the greatness of the Baal Halachas Gedolos. This is not, Bruce Markowitz. This is not Azariah Burzon writing a treatise. And we have to have commentaries on commentaries on commentaries. So when we're dealing with the BaHaG, that's what Rav Soloveitchik used to always teach us. You have a difficulty in an achron. You have a piece in, I don't know, you're learning a piece in the Chazon Ish and you don't understand what the man is talking about. You don't have any commitment to defend an achron, but a rishon, again, this is just the training that I can for. You may have a different training. I'm just giving you my upbringing. A rishon, if you don't understand a rishon, a guy stands in front of a Rembrandt painting and he goes like this.
But other Rishonim
The problem is not Rembrandt. The problem is you. You've got to break. You got to figure out the great. You understand? We're dealing with the greatest Rishonim. The BaHaG is like the pillar of the Rishonim that came afterwards.
But they don't agree with each other. I mean, the Rambam said no. He's also a Rishon. I mean, the fact that
but that doesn't mean that again. The Rambam contradicts himself sometimes. So what do? I say, okay, so the Rambam contradicted himself and it doesn't bother me. That's not the way I was trained. Rav Soloveitchik trained us to see that if the Rambam contradicted himself, then there are 2 opinions in the Rambam. And you've got to rack your brains to figure out what is the machlokas, what is the yisoda plukta between the Rambam and the Rambam. If you have 2 Rishonim that are at loggerheads, then it's your obligation within the context of Talmud Torah. You can't just write it off and say, well, nothing, it's garbage. You throw it in the rubbish. No.
No, I was just suggesting that maybe they needed to fill the number 613.
Okay, but again, I don't mind if you say they needed to fill the numbers, but you got to do it in a way that's consistent. The BaHaG was not a dumbbell.
No, but if not for that number,
you understand? He wasn't you or me. He was the BaHaG, the Baal Halachas Gedolos, one of the greatest Rishonim of all.
So if not for the number, though,
the whole issue of whether women are obligated in Megillah, it's all about the BaHaG, and you can go on and on and on. There's tons of literature of people who are even brighter than you and I who will rack their brains to try to understand the BaHaG. They won't just say, oh, he was short 4 mitzvahs, so he added them.
Unless maybe he did.
But then he's inconsistent. You're not dealing with a dumbbell here. You're dealing with someone who, the premise here that underlies our study is that the BaHaG is a Rishon, he understands the Torah, and there's some logic. Just to say, well, that's it.
To create
that's not going to get us anywhere. If we want to accomplish our goal and our responsibility to understand the BaHaG, we have to understand why these 4 he chose to continue to count and not the others.
But
that's what the Ramban is going to try to do. But I see that I keep running out of time here. Yeah. Okay,
if you characterize something as perfect versus a dumbbell and nothing in between, then one can't ask any questions because there is no question you can ask on perfection.
No,
we're not perfect, so we can't figure it
out. There's a difference between saying, I'm going to just write it off and I'm going to say, oh, he did this, he did that, he's not consistent, blah, blah, blah.
No, but no one's saying to do that.
And saying, I'm going to try, and if I can't succeed, at the end of the day, I may have to throw in the towel and says, Anochi HaKatan, the defect is in me. And I know that for sure the BaHaG, if he were here and alive, he would defend himself. I just can't come up with that defense. I'm not bright enough. I don't know enough. Do you hear the difference? In one case I say, well,
Unfortunately, without an introduction or preface or rationale on how the BaHaG made the list, we're just guessing. We can try our best. And people.
But again, it doesn't matter to me one iota whether we come up with the BaHaG or we come up with the Ramban. Do you understand my point? Even if you're going to tell me, well, the BaHaG never meant it. The cynics, when they learn Reb Chaim on the Rambam, they say, oh, the Rambam never meant it. I couldn't care less. I don't care what the Rambam meant. If Reb Chaim teaches it to me, I want to know what Reb Chaim is teaching. If the Ramban comes up with a thesis, I don't care historically about the physical, Ramache, Verm, and Shasar Gidim of the BaHaG. Did the BaHaG have that in mind? I'm not going to resurrect the BaHaG from the dead and ask him, well, do you agree with the Ramban's interpretation of what you wrote? I couldn't care less. It doesn't faze me in the least. I am not a historian.
No, but if you found
if I was a historian, then there are many parshias in the Torah which wouldn't make any sense to me. The Gemara tells me about Ben Sorah Mora Lo Hayiv Lo Divra. There'll never be a Ben Sorah Mora. The Torah tells me about certain kinds of Tumas Tzaras, that they never were and never will be. That never bothered us. We're not upset. In the book, which is called Halachic Man of my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik, if you ever read it, he writes over and over again that the great Chachamim were not interested. They weren't bothered whether it existed or it didn't exist. Drosh v'kabel schar, understand the Torah. So I don't know whether if the BaHaG walked into the room now, he would tell me, Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman, you had the wrong understanding of my writings. It wouldn't faze me in the least.
No,
it wouldn't faze me in the least. Again, what would I be excited about was I would ask the BaHaG, so tell me what you did think, Right. But again, now that we don't have the BaHaG in front of us, I just want to know what the Ramban thought.
If we did find a BaHaG that was missing in a library that explains his rationale,
right?
Would that matter to you?
Yes and no. It wouldn't matter to me in terms of what we're learning now, because I couldn't care less. I just want to know what the Ramban understood. It would matter to me because I'd like to hear if there's another approach. And then I would have the Ramban and the BaHaG. I would be wealthy because I have two for the price of one. Okay. Wish you all the best, and we'll talk about Lag BaOmer. Mr. Hashem, we'll see where we go with that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.